We have this tradition at SHB. The last panel has titles such as Past and Future, What We Learned, What We Will Do, and today we have this Past and Future panel. We also have another tradition. Ross used to start this panel, Bruce used to end it. We have Bruce end it again, and we have the honor of having Judith start it. So please, right. Judith.
Does the title have to be F as well?
Excuse me. Hi.
No one told me that.
Fashionably take. Okay, so what I'm going to do in the next 8 minutes is give you a signaling theory-based analysis of why fake news thrives so much online. And so we're going to go, since it's actually a little complicated, we're going to go through this a little bit quickly. But, okay, let's try that again. There you go. Okay, so there have been a number of studies that show that online fake news spreads faster and farther than true information. So the question I want to address here is, why is that? So not just what is it, but to understand something from a theoretical perspective. Unlike almost all of you, I tend to be almost all theory with some design thrown in. I basically don't actually deal with discovering any facts. I am a customer for all of your research. And so this is this somewhat inscrutable statement. My goal is by the end of this talk, it will make a lot of sense to you, is that fakes, false stories, are the high heels of the internet. And that may be inscrutable now, but it will make quite a bit of sense, I hope. So much of my work is based on using signaling theory as it's been developed in evolutionary biology. This is something I've been doing for about a quarter of a century now. And signaling theory is a model of how communication evolved that basically says that sort of the way that in evolution as a whole, you have the problem of survival of the fittest, what's alive, is that in the world of communication, that sort of central arms race is around deception and honesty. That it can often be profitable to lie if you can get away with it. But if all communication was false, the audience would generally suffer from following things they learned that were false information, so they would learn not to believe anything and there would be no communication. And so the problem that signaling theory looks at is how does communication evolve to be, if not always reliable, at least reliable enough to function. So one of the ways, so the basic sort of equation you can say here is that a reliable signal is going to be one that's affordable to give by those who actually have the quality that signal claims, but it's unaffordable by those who don't. So for instance, this is a gazelle spotting. It turns out that gazelles, given certain predators, the fastest ones don't run away. Gazelles are fast, but the really fast ones don't run. They jump up and down in place instead. And so the signaling theory analysis of this otherwise really peculiar seeming behavior is that they have the time to escape. The resource they have extra is because they're fast, they have time, and they can waste it. And it turns out that those coursing predators actually have learned, as they get older, not to go after the ones that are doing this, but to go after the running ones who they know to be slower. And we can talk about the antlers later, but I don't think I have time. But that will be at Bruce's house. I will hold forth on antlers. Obviously, so in the human world where, for instance, we may care as a status signal about money, wasting money on a super expensive car is a way of showing it off. One of the things that's also very important, particularly in signaling theory and biology does a better job of doing that, is that the cost has to be in the domain of what's being signaled. That car is a costly and reliable signal of wealth, but not of being sexy, even if you bought it because you thought it was going to show off that you were sexy. Some signals, you can have two things that signal the same thing. One of those is reliable. The other is also a signal, but it may or may not be true. It's not reliable. So fashion, I am claiming, is a signal of status in an information economy. And that's an important thing to understand because it's a signal that has only existed in the last, say, 500 years. It arose 600 years, around the 1430s. And what I'm working on in this chapter is saying that what fashion does, and by fashion I mean anything where what what you show to what you display on yourself as an identity signal is something where the meaning remains the same. It's your position in that fashion hierarchy, but you have to keep changing what you're doing in order to keep up with it. And there are fashions, for instance, in clothing. This is like 100 years after fashion first developed. All of a sudden, everywhere people were spouting these enormous ruffs. Nothing like that had been seen before. 50 years later, they'd all disappeared. But there are fashions in business. There's been some interesting work called management fashion theory. There are fashions in dog breeds. This is now the most fashionable dog in America. Fashions in contemporary painting styles. So it's all kinds of things have fashion. And it can show, so you have to have access to the information of what's next. You have to have the acumen to know that given all kinds of possible next things, you are good at picking it out. And you have to have this willingness to adapt over and over and over. If you look at most of human history, people have not been actually very interested in things that are new. They didn't like to change. It's a lot of effort. And so part of my thesis is that what fashion, as being in fashion, once it became a signal of status, it really opened the door to our constant way of wanting to innovate and having new innovations because status signaling is so important across many species that when showing off the new thing became that's a lot of what gave people the impetus to be willing to adopt things. Now, one of the most important things I want to say here about fashion and innovation, though, is that innovations are adopted because they have utility. And so the more useful they are, the more likely they are to be adopted. Fashion is sort of the opposite. Because it's a social signal, it is more useful when the thing has disutility. And that's what I meant by the fake shoes. Because if something is useful in its own sense, and I want to show that I'm really influential, but it doesn't really show it. If I walk around and, they come out with the most comfortable shoes ever, lots of people are going to adopt them because they're really great to walk on. It has nothing to do with having that special social knowledge. So the object that is the fashion of the moment, the less useful and the most disutilitarian it is, the better it functions as a fashion. And so if you are putting up news online, something that's true, lots of people will do the research and find that it's true, and they'll post it independently, and it's true. It doesn't show anything about social influence. But when that information is fake, it's very, very good at showing your social affiliations and your social space because it exists. It's really its only force of existence is within that particular social cascade. This is a quote from the big Deb Roy, et cetera, paper where they were saying that misinformation containment policies, I think their work and their research is great, and I use it sort of as some of the basis for this, but one of the things they say, it should emphasize behavioral interventions, excellent idea, like labeling and incentives to dissuade the spread of information. That's where having the right underlying model of why people are spreading misinformation is key. It's not a mistake. It's not that that if you label it, it's the fact that it is false that makes it useful. So labeling it as false is not going to have a particularly dissuasive purpose if indeed I am right that the fact that some fashion-like behavior is underlying this, and now you can look at this slide and have it make sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. And Simson.
Thanks. Let's see if this works. Wow. So I've never been to this event before, so I apologize that I didn't entirely know what I was getting into. So this is a brief presentation with just 2 ideas or 3 ideas. I wanted to talk about the digital corpora, which is sort of like data you can use, and then something about differential privacy. So for the past many years, I've been developing a open collection of 24 terabytes of unstructured data and cybercrime scenarios, which everybody in this room can download and use without IRB approval. And it's at digitalcorporate.org. And it has, for example, cell phone dumps, disk images, files, network packet dumps, and scenarios. And many of the scenarios have been built by students or by research groups that have multiple characters and specific challenges to uncover and multiple problems. And this was built to assist in digital forensics education, and it was also built to enable research so that researchers could all work from the same data set, an open data set, and share their work and publish, and we could actually see how to get better on certain kinds of techniques. And the reason to work with this data rather than like all the hard drives I bought on eBay or actual FBI case data or criminal data is that there's no privacy sensitive information in it. There's no PII. There's no pornography or illegal content. So you don't have to worry about giving pornography to people under 18. There's, even though it is scenarios, I don't allow into the collection child exploitation scenarios because I'm just tired of that, and I don't think it's particularly needed for teaching. And I think it turns off a lot of people to the field. And then in some cases there are solutions, and the solutions are also distributed, but they're distributed as encrypted files. So I have a form that allows accredited faculty or law enforcement to get the decrypt password, which allows me to track who's using this corpus that's freely available. Now, in May 2023, DARPA ended the SafeDocs program, which was to build a formally verified PDF reader. And so an important part of that was having a formal specification for the PDF format that was machine readable and correct and didn't conflict with itself. And DARPA doesn't provide long-term money to host the results of DARPA research. So they gave me their 8 million PDF corpus that they had put together, and I put that up. And so like I get free web hosting from Amazon, which is really good because it's thousands of dollars a month that I'm getting for free. So you can download this. There's two collections. There's Safe Docs and Unsafe Docs. These are 8 million PDFs collected from the internet. So, and we've done a survey. This is unpublished data, but I surveyed people who asked for the things to find out how they learned about it and what they're making use of, and there'll probably be a follow-up survey. So that's data you can use. The second thing I wanted to talk a little bit about differential privacy and start off saying that persistence really pays off. So back in earlier this year, we published, actually I guess recently, NIST SP 800-188. I used to be at NIST. It's a special pub on de-identifying government data sets. The thing to notice here is that this second public draft was published in December 2016 when I was still at NIST, and the goal was to have this document done before I left NIST, and then it was to have it done when I was at Census, and you know these projects, but if you keep at things, it will eventually get published. So after 2016, I kept wanting to do it, so I finally had some time, and in 2022 we put out the third public draft, and you can see that the number of authors went from just me to other people. And so like a good lesson here is to collaborate. I know you all know this lesson, but those of you who don't, it's really important to collaborate. You get better results. And then we actually put out the third public draft, and it's been published now as NIST SP 800-188. Now, de-identification is a bad word in the privacy crowd because it doesn't work. It doesn't actually protect privacy in any formal manner. But de-identification is going to be with us for a long time because the formal privacy techniques don't work with the majority of data sets that we wish to release. So if you need a good citations on why de-identification doesn't work, you should go to this US government guidance. And it will tell you both how to do it and why not to do it, or how to try to minimize your risks. And we also talk about how to set up a disclosure review board. And DRBs are like IRBs, or many of you are familiar with IRBs, which protect the research subjects before you start experimenting on them. And DRBs protect the data after it goes out. We also have a list of all the de-identification snafus. Now, finally, in the remaining 2 minutes, I just wanted to talk about these graphs. You've seen a lot of graphs. You have differential privacy, this accuracy versus privacy loss graph. And this is just a lousy graph. Nobody knows what it means. And here's like when I used it in my presentation, and nobody really can understand this because it's like an ROC curve. But earlier this year, NIST put out a document I wasn't involved in. This IPD means that it's like an initial public draft. And they had this new graph for visualizing privacy versus accuracy. I'll blow it up here. And the idea is this shows you the 95% confidence range. With like an epsilon of 1, you're going to have a number between those two 95% of the time. This is just a brilliant visualization for the impact of setting the privacy loss parameter on what range of values differential privacy can give you. And so I built it into a lab notebook for some students, and they all had to build these graphs. And so if anybody wants this, but this is showing that like there's a counting query and the true number is 8. And if you set epsilon to be 1, 95% of the time it's going to be between those. But you can also draw the 99% of the time and the 99.9% of the time. And then you can ask the students, like, what do you do if the value is outside that range? And like that's the time you rolled the dice and you got a number that was really wacko. And so that's a good thing. So I have a book coming out on differential privacy next year, and here's one of the illustrations. We made a decision not to have graphs for people because graphs don't really make sense to most people, so instead we have cartoons. And the cartoonist is a national. Please do not photograph this. This is not for distribution. So please delete the photograph that you just took. But this is the one graph that's in the book, which shows that graph you saw before, but there's the cartoon. And I'm done, so thank you very much, and I won't talk about the remaining slides.
Thank you, Simson. Matt, now.
All right, so I'm gonna do something unconventional at this workshop, and I'm gonna speak mostly from a script because I've been a little bit addled the last couple of days. Yeah, I mean, I'm trained to be a historian, and historians tend to read from scripts, so it's good practice for me. All right, so my name is Matt Goerzen. I'm a PhD student in the history of science here at Harvard. I'm just finishing my second year of studies, so I'm mostly thinking about my dissertation. I just finished my qualifying exams last week, which might explain that. All right, so before I talk about my dissertation, I want to talk a little bit about my past and a short introduction to some of my previous work, work that I think intersects with a lot of the interests in the room. So in 2017, I began working at a nonprofit called Data and Society, and my goal was to develop a framework for thinking about what we called media manipulation by using the cybersecurity kind of logic. So I was thinking about people using Twitter's promoted tweets feature to harass people who block them, or trying to manipulate particular user demographics with advertisements, or posting fake information with a persona to try to bait journalists into spreading sensational and ultimately damaging information. So I began thinking about these techniques as the exploitation of socio-technical vulnerabilities, so affordances emergent at the intersection of technical design and user behavior, and so not reducible to the discrete kind of technical vulnerabilities that are maybe more typical of cybersecurity. So in 2018 at Data Society, we began to work with the U.S. Census Bureau, and the census had become concerned that many of the conventional cyber threats, things like data breaches, denial of service, were not the only threats posed to a successful census. The census, enshrined in the Constitution, succeeds by counting as many residents of the U.S. as possible. That information is then used for apportionment, the distribution of funds, social science, a variety of other fun / risky things. But discussions of a possible citizenship question was making people concerned that media narratives could jeopardize or actively suppress the participation of particular demographics. And other events were making it clear that such narratives could promulgate on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, with or without the help of the then president, right? So to succeed, the census couldn't treat itself as a trusted infrastructure. It had to earn the status of a trustworthy infrastructure, to draw on the distinction from yesterday. To succeed, the census needed to take into consideration the risk profiles of all stakeholders, everyone that the census hoped to count, everyone that stood to benefit or lose from success or failure, that is to say the threat models of communities who had genuine reasons for concern, historical precedent for concern, and people telling them to be concerned, potentially for invalid reasons, but reasons nonetheless. Moreover, it had to understand how these risk profiles were entangled with the vulnerabilities appearing in social media. So we came to think of this as socio-technical security or relational security. And drawing on the theories of standpoint epistemology and STS, people like Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, we developed a framework for thinking about the entanglements of these different stakeholders, how each had a unique vision of what security related to the census meant, for example, not being deported or not being rounded up and put into an internment camp. And the success of the census depended on ensuring that those stakeholders trusted the census to give them that security. So the security engineer, the trust and safety expert, the communication strategist, and the community organizer were all kind of activated as security practitioners. The cybersecurity of the census was not just about protecting data leaks, it was also about protecting the possibility of acquiring the data in the first place. So this is a slide of a conference paper I presented with a couple of colleagues on this idea of socio-technical security. It doesn't relate to the census, but if you're interested, there's maybe some interesting ideas in there. So as part of this research, I became particularly interested in two figures, the idea of like a troll, the person exploiting these social media affordances, and the so-called white hat, so the white hat hacker. And in fact, I started to wonder who was positioned to pen test social media, to find the socio-technical vulnerabilities emergent at the intersection of human behavior and social technologies. All right, so now we get into your past, right? So together with anthropologist Gabrielle Coleman, who sadly couldn't be here, I set out to explore this question by looking at the emergence of white hat hacking in the 1990s. We dug through archives, interviewed nearly 40 participants, and ultimately produced a report called Wearing Many Hats, which is a story of hacker professionalization in the 1990s. We focused on two major case studies. First, the full disclosure movement, which controversially publicized vulnerabilities to enable their redress, beginning in 1993 with the bug track mailing list. And second, the socialization of the very idea of white hat or ethical hackers, hacking as hackers working to reconfigure their public image and become a profession hireable. So we came up with a couple ideas. One of them was security by spectacle, to describe the media work done by hackers as they rebranded themselves by getting articles published in newspapers and things like that, ultimately conditioning them to enter the security industry. And then working with the media, and then also the idea of bottom-up securitization, so bringing in securitization into a state kind of context from an outsider perspective. Working with the media, they argued that the real enemy wasn't hackers, but rather the negligence of big companies like Microsoft. Of course, security economics and other processes played major roles in winning these arguments. All right, and so my future is doing this work. I realized how many stories like this beg for historical treatment. Mostly, I became very interested in the very idea of what a vulnerability was as it relates to technologies, or computing in particular. So now I'm a PhD student in the history of science here at Harvard, working to figure out what I'm going to do for my dissertation. The current idea is to advance a structured history of computer security told with reference to the evolving idea /concept /object /condition /commodity /phenomenon of the vulnerability. Vulnerability appears in foundational documents like this, the 1970 Ware Report, in relatively broad strokes. It's suitably abstract. I'm running a little bit on time, but basically at this time people thought maybe they could come up with a model for security that would eliminate the question of vulnerability altogether, a provably secure operating system. That didn't work out too well, and so in the 1970s we moved towards what was called a whack-a-mole or penetrate and patch approach that we still know and love today. With the popularization of networking in the 1980s and 1990s, the stakeholders and exposure expanded, vulnerabilities became increasingly discerned and enumerated with rigor, even as certain actors like Microsoft downplayed their existence. The exploit became, in effect, a scientific instrument, something that could prove the existence of the underlying phenomena, the vulnerabilities, and also a hacking tool that would further insecurity. So I call it an ambivalent instrument. Before long, the existence of vulnerability is anything but controversial. They are numbered, systematically enumerated, and of course even commodified. So now I see the idea of computer-based vulnerabilities expanding again. More people are entangled with technologies in more ways. Organizations like the Citizen Lab show us that by looking at different actors, different reference, we can find vulnerabilities that might otherwise be ignored, and vulnerabilities that are central to another entity's threat model. Indeed, as with the census, a nation-state's threat model could be directly at odds with an individual's, for example, if they are a dissident. Meanwhile, social media and AI affords a host of novel new vulnerabilities. These can be informational, or if we believe the hype, at a level of existential risk, right? So I'm currently understanding this as kind of like an hourglass shape, where kind of a broad, abstract notion of vulnerability narrows into very particular specified vulnerabilities and then expands again as new kind of threat areas emerge, right? All right, so ultimately what I'm interested in here is our future, right? So over the next 3 years, I'm going to be working on producing this history, and being at this workshop has been great. It's already helping me understand some questions that I can ask of this history, but I'd also really like for you to communicate to me some of the questions that you have for your own history. And I also ultimately I want to produce like a usable history, right? I mean, if we could think about how security by spectacle helped move Microsoft in the 1990s, what are some of those ideas that proved useful in the past that we might use today with things like privacy concerns? So that's it. Please email me if you're interested.
Thank you, Matt.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aileen Nielsen. I teach law. I'm a law professor, and in particular, I teach tort law, which is the law of accidents, and privacy law, which is everything to do with controlling personal information. And in the U.S., it's a fairly poorly defined, and I would say largely unsuccessful body of law. So I spend a lot of time thinking about whether privacy law, unlike tort law, which I tell my students has made us all drastically safer in the last century or so, will privacy law change the privacy environment? And because so often the theoretical and empirical work that I consume tends to suggest no, I would say that we also have the second question, which I can't answer at all, and I don't know if anyone can just yet. And can it, right? Is it just sort of set up with the wrong paradigm? Right now, I'm trying to honor sort of the panel that I'm on, thinking about past and future. So I've given you the past, largely unsuccessful, ill-defined, at least in the American experience. Right now, and in the near future, privacy law in the US and in Europe is seeking to furnish solutions to certain perceived privacy problems, like a lack of transparency about data use, a lack of control about data use, a surfeit of friction in the products that we use most often, even when we are trying to exercise some degree of agency. One common solution we have seen here in the US, we have sort of a wave of state data protection laws rolling out, and they are sort of like mini GDPRs. We're sort of copying our European cousins. We say, let's give people more rights. Let's double down on sort of this autonomy model that we have by just creating more rights. The latest and greatest, the last few years, has been user rights backed up by technical affordances. So it's not just that you have the right to access your data. We're defining it with reference to certain technical things. You need to be able to export your data in a commonly used format. So now in near future, two that are of interest to me, one is the Global Privacy Control, GPC. It's a way of broadcasting a particular choice. Do not sell my data is the legal instantiation it has here in the US right now. For many of you, this will sound a lot like do not track, and we know how successful that was. If you've ever heard of it, you know it wasn't successful, but we now have GPC. We also have data access and portability rights. So with GPC, I think it will be really interesting to study the success of the affordance itself, right? If you give people this way, in theory, around some degree of friction, does it actually work in terms of promoting privacy? And with regard to data access and portability rights, I see this as providing an affordance where we can study the success of the privacy law more generally. And I am very much loading in a normative stance of the success means sort of less data flow, less data collected, right? And you can question that, but for this 7-minute presentation, that's how I'm defining it. So the motivating question again, will privacy law change our information environments? Do these affordances actually reduce the information flows that people don't seem to want? And can privacy law change our information environments? So global privacy controls, unlike do not track, they have actually received some legal recognition, first in California, but also now in Connecticut and Colorado. We can expect that more US states, probably blue ones, although this is not necessarily all that polarized, are going to follow suit and in theory give this some legal status. And the Global Privacy Control Initiative itself is selling this point, saying, hey, you know all those do not sell rights you have? This is how you can take advantage of them. We are planning to study this empirically to look at the success of the affordance, looking at a representative sample of US adults. So this is planned work that hasn't started. I'm working with Yafit Levaretz, who's at Baruch Business School. We're interested in looking at, if you look at ordinary US adults, what's the prevalence of adoption, right? Now that you've given this some legal teeth, does that make a difference? We're not going to look at all US states, but we're going to look at sort of a panel of states that both provide legal effect and don't. Measure GPC adoptions. We're assuming that very few people will have adopted this, so then we want to see how much do we need to pay people to adopt this? This thing that's in theory in their favor, I'm going to guess they're not adopting. I'm going to guess we're going to have to pay them a lot of money because it's a pain in the butt. And finally, we're going to look at stickiness, because Yafit in particular is interested in decision architecture. And what she has noticed is there's no legal requirement that firms can't re-query you. So this has legal effect, but there's nothing to stop a firm from saying, I notice you're broadcasting the GPC. I just want to tell you about all of the things you're missing out on. And I want to tell you how you can disable that broadcast. So we're imagining that rather than overcoming problematic decision architectures, this is simply going to sort of shift the decision architecture, possibly with the same results. So our working hypotheses, there's probably low adoption right now. We're probably going to have to pay people a lot of money to adopt this. And when we look at sort of the panel data over a number of months, we're imagining even when we pay people to adopt this, that they're going to rapidly sort of opt out again, presumably because of whatever new decision architectures we see. So this is giving us one possibility to look at the success of the affordance, right? Law is now giving us technical affordances. Is that working? Secondly, I want ways to look at the success of the statutory scheme itself, right? So if we understand privacy law initiatives largely to be about reducing information flows and reducing data stores and reducing firm rather than consumer control over these, we can also look at the entire statutory scheme. That's where we get to data access portability rights, this right you have to sort of easily get all the data that a firm has about you. We're going to use a delightful and underused tool, homomorphic encryption. So here I'm working with Sarah Scheffler, and one of the goals here is not just to provide sort of an MVP, a proof that you can use this in empirical social science, but also Sarah is planning to build this out as an entire pipeline so that people like me, who are not cryptographers, can ethically touch sensitive data. So for example, when Alessandro mentioned that they are going to block certain websites because they don't want that data, we are actually planning to go out and ask people, hey, can you export your Facebook data and can we have it? And the reason we think we can ethically do this is we're planning to encrypt it, right, so that we never actually have the data, right? And so we're only going to be able to run certain operations. But with those operations, we're hoping we can learn enough about the kinds of data, including highly sensitive data, like who you're sending sexy messages to on Facebook late at night or whatever, or what embarrassing Google searches you have that they've kept in your data exports. We're trying to get a sense of exactly what's there. And the reason for this is we want to know whether something like GDPR, right, there's this assumption in my academic community, privacy law scholars, that Europeans are in this sort of privacy paradise, and that the wonderful GDPR has made them much, much safer than we are here in America. I tend to be skeptical of that, and I see this as one way of testing that, right? Regardless of whether you have facial compliance, when you actually look at the data stores, including sensitive data stores, do we find out that perhaps even with the legal compliance that the data stores look the same, right? And so the thing that most people ultimately care about looks no different, which gets back to this question of does and can privacy law change anything? So that's everything. If you have comments or other ideas that are relevant to privacy law, I am happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aileen and Bruce.
There we go. So a bit of talking about captchas. So captchas are super interesting, and I collect captcha jokes. So please send them to me. I think this is a great one. And for the historians among you.
Okay.
Is it the ship of Theseus one?
No. So this is an actual captcha I received. This is no joke. And I stared at this for a long time.
Sydney Pound Bake.
And I still don't know. I mean, I ended up skipping it, right? I mean, this would flummox an AI. I want to talk about trust in AI. So trust is essential to society. We trust many 1,000 times a day. We're all sitting here. Nobody's attacking each other. If we were a room full of chimpanzees, we would never get away with that. I mean, society can't function without trust. And to the extent that we don't notice the amount of trust that that happens around us every day is really a measure of how well it works. So I want to make 3 basic arguments. One, that there are 2 kinds of trust. Interpersonal trust and social trust came out a bit yesterday, and we regularly conflate them. 2, that the confusion is going to increase with artificial intelligence. We're going to make a fundamental category error. We're going to think of AIs as friends when they're actually services. And 3, that the corporations controlling AI systems will make use of that error to take advantage of us, right? They will not be trustworthy. And I guess lastly, there's a role of government to create trust in society, which means regulation. So back up a bit. Trust is a complicated concept. It's a complicated word. The word has a lot of different meanings. It's very overloaded. So there's a personal, intimate trust, interpersonal trust. When I say I trust a friend, it's less about their actions and more about them as a person. Right? It's a reliance. They will behave in a trustworthy manner. I know them. And so that's interpersonal trust. There's also a less intimate, less personal trust. I don't know someone or their motivations, but I can trust their behavior. So think about whether we trusted the people who made the food for lunch or the airplane pilot that flew you here. Right? It's really more about reliability and predictability. And I think that is social trust, the ability to trust strangers. Both are essential in society today. This is an anecdote I got from Judith. Taxi driver used to be one of the most dangerous professions in this country. And Uber changed that through pervasive surveillance. Right? Both parties are under surveillance, and there's this competition for star rankings. And that made that whole interaction more trustworthy, even though my Uber driver could moonlight as a burglar overnight. I mean, I don't know and don't care. And there are people who write about the difference in living in high trust and low trust societies. And what's important is how it scales. Social trust scales better. You used to need a personal relationship to get a loan with a banker. And now it's done algorithmically. And that scale is vital. And it means we regularly trust, or not, governments, corporations, brands, organizations. And that's primarily enabled by government and technology. But because we use the same word for both, we regularly confuse them. And we make the category error, which we do all the time. Governments, organizations, systems, corporations, We think of them as friends when they're actually services. And I think we're about to make the same category error with AI. We're going to think of them as friends when they're not. In the near term, of course, AIs are controlled by corporations, which will use them towards their profit maximizing goal. Right? They won't be friends. At best, they'll be useful services. More likely, they'll spy on us. They'll try to manipulate us. This is, of course, nothing new. We all know about surveillance being the business model of the internet. But we're going to use all of these services as if there are agents working on our behalf when they're in fact going to be double agents working for their corporate owners. We'll trust them, but they won't be trustworthy. And I think it's going to be much worse than things like social media for a couple of reasons. The first is that the AI systems will be more relational. We'll be conversing them using natural language. And as such, we're naturally going to ascribe human-like characteristics for them. And that relational nature will make it easier for them to do their work. So did your chatbot recommend a particular vacation because it's the best for you, or are they getting a kickback, right, from some advertiser on the back end? Or the same thing with a political question. The second reason to be more concerned is the AIs will be more intimate. I think one of the promises of AI right now is personal digital assistant. Your advocate to others, a butler for you, a relationship counselor, a therapist. And that's going to require intimacy greater than your email, your search engine, your cloud storage system, your phone. You're going to want it with you 24/7, training on everything you do. Right? This is the idea of the Microsoft new Copilot thing they just advertised. Right? You want it to know everything, yet that's incredibly scary. But we will naturally, in a personal relationship, default to thinking of it as our friend. You'll speak to it in natural language, it'll respond in kind. If it has an instantiation, it'll look like a robot, it'll be humanoid or maybe an animal. But it'll interact with the whole of your existence, kind of unlike your search engine. And you're going to want to trust it. Right? It will act trustworthy, but it won't be trustworthy. And this speaks to the need to build trustworthy AI. For many things, but really, in my mind, mainly for democratic purposes. And it's not something the market is going to provide on its own. So I've been pushing for public AI models. I mean, a model that is not built under a corporation, either by academia or the government or a nonprofit group. Something that will require political accountability, not just market accountability. Not as a replacement, but as a counterbalance to corporate-owned AI. Now, I don't think we can ever make AI into our friends, but we can make them into trustworthy services. And we can have them be agents and not double agents. But I think this will only happen if government mandates it. And government has the power to do this. And I think more importantly, it's essential for government to do this. Because if we assume one of the points of government is to create social trust, right, we have to lean on it to do so. And that's it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ross. And well, let's get started. Sure.
For Bruce, I've had an Amazon Echo, the Alexa, in my house for quite some time, and it keeps suggesting to me, I can do these extra things for you, and I keep saying, I never want to hear suggestions about additional services again, to which it replies, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. And so I realize that I'm in an abusive relationship. And it's kind of useful to have that human model, to think about, okay, I recognize an abusive relationship. And it's also kind of useful to think, well, what do I do in this situation? I'd really like to have the other one next door so I can say, so what's Alexa not telling me? And then ask Alexa, what's Siri not telling me? And so is this not a useful, in some ways, model that and is it not in some ways fortunate that we've been trained by 3 big companies to not trust AI over the last 7 or 8 years? How long has it been?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that translates from us to the general population. I mean, Alexa's popular. Siri's popular.
Oh, and it's popular to use, but the question is, do people? I think we love them, but again, abusive relationship or the nagging grandmother or right. You can love something and still have over that time have really understood its flaws. So, sorry to use could be my grandfather. So.
But yeah, I would also, I think the key bit of that relationship is that people in general want to please others. You want others to like you, and that's a lot of what makes it manipulative. You know, like when you talk about an abusive relationship, was there no relationship there? If you didn't feel anything and something seemed abusive, you would just walk away from it. So you are already kind of enmeshed in it. And so I think the dangerous point with those is because they're so relational that there's that subconscious desire to please them. So when you say you want to have two of them, it's like if they say, you know, are you wearing those shoes today? Well, you know, we could tell you where there's a sale on new shoes. Yeah, and then you have another one agreeing with you. You start to feel social pressure from a machine. It may not.
I was thinking more like having two car dealers to play off of each other.
Right, but they're meant to be competitors. I'm just saying I think the threat of our being susceptible to trying to please socially presenting machines is where they get a lot of their power.
Can I add something? Thank you. So Bruce said that he's a big believer in open source AI. I think that's what you said.
Public AI
Public AI.
is not. It could be open source.
Right. Well, it might have to be open source, but
it might have, but it's
we
necessarily
could
not
discuss that.
sufficient.
But my fear is that any open source or public systems are going to be co-opted. And the example that I'm going to use is Home Assistant. So if you have an Alexa, one of the things it can do is turn on and off lights, and it does that okay, but there's a thing called Habitat that does it maybe a little better, and they work together. And there's an open source alternative called Home Assistant, which is free home control that doesn't have the surveillance capitalism built in, except now it has a company behind it. And we're going to we've seen a lot of these public systems become co-opted because they're expensive to maintain, and we don't want to use taxpayer funds for that sort of thing.
I want to partially agree with you, but for probably different reasons. And I think the reason is that even though I've been accused of being pretty dark or pessimistic in my outlook, my book is called The Darkening Web, and then the second iteration was with New Darkness. Specifically, I'm not terribly worried about it for reasons that you articulate, but because for one, that means that the incentive will be for data portability to be there. They're going to want to have, the big corporations will allow, as long as you just have one monopoly, will allow us to shift from one to the other, which means it will be, hopefully, through the work of you and your grad students when they get to positions of power, we'll be there to basically be able to have some control over our data. We'll be able to decide we're going to exclude this, this, and this in categories that will probably make sense or not make sense, and which will then have to be duplicated using synthetic data on the back end for commercial purposes. But we will have, through this incentive structure that you described, we will have the ability to regulate something I think it partially is easier to regulate than some of the cybersecurity risks we're dealing with.
Soj. I just wanted to comment on some stuff that Aileen said about privacy laws. I mean, I think the big thing is really just enforcement, and whether the laws have an effect is directly dependent on the enforcement efforts. I mean, like if you look right now at the federal docket, the number of VPPA cases that have been filed, it's like over 100 in the past year or two, because plaintiffs' attorneys have discovered that there are trackers on all of these websites, and there's a private right of action there, and like that's had an immediate effect with lots of sites are now asking questions about should we be having this tracker on our website and removing them because they see all the litigation that's happening. And that seems to be happening with the GPC as well. So like, California DOJ has made it no secret that they're doing these experiments, right, to see who's actually using GPC. This was the Sephora case. They're doing these scans of the web. There was a paper on this, I guess like a year ago at PETS, where folks were looking at this. And so, I mean, it seems to be happening, but it's the enforcement that's pushing it.
Yeah, so I appreciate these examples. I wonder cynically whether this is just a moment in time and it will decay. And I will say I have some work looking at enforcement and GDPR, and at least there, it's not always clear that you get responses to enforcement, right? So there's like one Google Fonts case, it's not clear that everyone else, like that it has much expressive effect, right? And so it might be that you have to go out and enforce against each firm, in which case it becomes incomparably expensive. But I definitely welcome pushback and some optimism about privacy in California.
Jeffrey.
My question is also for Aileen. So I really appreciate your discussion of controller data. I'd be really curious from a legal perspective on ownership. So for instance, my Amazon search history, who owns that asset? Is it me, Amazon, some combination?
Oh my gosh. So this is an evergreen topic and has been for at least 30 years in legal scholarship. It's a particularly exciting topic, I think, right now with the advent of large language models. I think what's really interesting is a lot of firms training on that data have been playing around a lot with their licensing agreements. Both becoming more generous or more restrictive, depending on which way they think the winds are blowing. And the last non-answer I'll give you is we have these things in law called the restatement, where you kind of write out like the restatement of contract law. This is what's mostly true in most of the states. And they're currently, for the first time ever, thinking about including data as property, which they haven't for decades. And they don't necessarily think they have an answer, but they think it's economically important enough that they should at least treat the topic. So that's me totally dodging the question.
Do you have any inclination when they do treat it as property, who's going to be given rights to, or I guess be given?
Well, that's the other interesting thing, and I think this is interesting not just for law, but also for economics, right? What it really is co-creation. I actually, to self-promote, I put out a piece in the NYU Law Review on this question of like when you're thinking about Reddit, and who owns the data everyone's been trained on? Well, sure, maybe the initial author. And one interesting thing on Reddit, one way they updated their terms of use when ChatGPT sort of made its first big splashes, they said, we have rights, but we're also recognizing users have rights. And they sort of left it ambiguous. Now they've gone ahead, and despite this ambiguity that they recognized in print, they went ahead and licensed their data anyway, but we don't quite know what theirs versus the users. But it's very much co-creation, right? I write a brilliant post on Reddit. But Reddit put in a lot of resources for me to do it. So did the mods. So did the people I was sort of interacting with. So again, dodging the question, but it's this interesting area where there's no more legal certainty than there was decades ago, and yet the economic stakes are far higher now.
Thank you.
Margot. And then I have Andrew, Jean, and Elisa. That was it. Okay.
Okay, I have a quick shameless plug because it ties into the question that was asked. So Jean and I and Samir have a slightly dated paper on peer production of privacy protection, which kind of talks about like some of this data can be considered to be co-produced, and it needs controls that are not just looking at like individual controls, but like so. The question that we are trying to answer is like if I go to a party and Rick takes a photo of me, and I go to Zena's party, who actually owns that photo? Is it Zena, Rick, or me? Could be anyone. But then.
Can I interject there? So for photos, it's a much clearer copyright question that does have an answer, which is kind of interesting.
It's a generic point about like there's a lot of data is like not just your own. But I do like the question that you're asking really, which is what impact does privacy law actually have, right? And Serge pointed out like it's about enforcement. It really is not, right? If you have increased enforcement, all that is going to happen is that you're going to build the cost of enforcement and litigation into the cost of your product. That's going to happen, and we've seen this with Facebook. But I think like
disagree.
Please go ahead. And
I
do
like
that.
the controversy.
Yeah. So, but there's like a couple of things that I have personally witnessed in like the multiple companies that my friends are privacy engineers in. One thing that has happened is that companies have actively centralized all of their databases. And this is a problem because now when you have a breach, you don't have a breach of a small database, you have a breach of a large database. And the reason that's happened is because of all of this regulation, you want to use things like Big ID. And Big ID charges by the number of databases that you scan. And so fewer databases means it costs less. So that's sort of like the negative thing that has happened is it's actually centralized risk. The good thing that has happened is data minimization. Like that's the one thing that lawyers across the board understand. So after like some of the CCPA, CPRA things came out, we had the biggest amount of like removal of data. They're like, this data is costing us money, let's just get rid of it. So, but there hasn't been a lot of like introspection of how lawyers are responding and how they're creating internal policies to respond to this thing. I don't think it's necessarily improving privacy, it's just changing the architecture of internal systems.
Andrew.
Yeah, a brief comment for Judith. I really like your framing there. I would really be interested in your feelings about how fast fashion fits into that framework, because I think fast fashion as misinformation would be an interesting viewpoint. Can I just make another comment about the previous one? The communication studies and the work of people like Justin Meredith in No Sense of Place and Reeves and Nash in the media equation, I think is really highly relevant for the framing you've got there, Bruce. And if you're not familiar with that,
I'm not. Email me.
Yeah,
I have those books.
Okay.
So I'll lend them to you. So fast fashion is really interesting, particularly given the name of this panel about past and future, because as I said, fashion as a phenomenon started around the 14th century. And at that point, you could look at the rate of change of fashion by the rate that information could flow. So even then, Paris was the fashion headquarters, and things moved to, say, the Polish court over the course of a year, because that's how long it took a doll with the current fashion to get from Paris to Warsaw. And so you can look at how things speed up as information moves. You know, even looking at top 10 or top 100 hit songs on the radio, the amount of time that it took that a song stayed moved as the rate of information around the world has changed. So with fast fashion, what you get there is the problem of something where you have, so the real problem with fast fashion is basically it's an environmental disaster. That, you know, right now there are fashions at places like Shine where they change every few weeks. And so one of the most enormous sources of just physical waste is synthetic clothing. So it's full of plastic and it gets thrown away all the time. And it's the problem there is in the embedding of something that's essentially information into a physical substrate at a time when information travels this quickly. When I first started thinking about this was at the sort of very early web days, and was thinking that virtual fashion was going to be sort of the solution as we moved online, and there would be something about the way we presented ourselves online. Would that take over and take some of the pressure off of clothing? And so I think what you see with fake news, these fake news issues, is that certainly is not the panacea. That effectively, you know, Twitter is a world where your self-presentation is essentially a series of links and tweets. And, you know, I think that logic of disutility has shown that that's where that has a problem, though at least it's not quite the environmental disaster.
Jen.
I love your willingness to accept approach, and as long as you're doing stuff on what I mean, I think you could also do this other thing that would be interesting in your vast free time. There's the do you guys remember the Data Liberation Front from Google? And you can exfiltrate all your data from Google and see what your data is. It used to be if you used the Data Liberation Front tools, it deleted all your data. You still can go through multiple steps.
It didn't delete logs.
You delete a lot of your data.
Okay, but logs stay with Google.
Yes, the logs stay with Google. I'm just saying, the willingness to accept, that seemed like an early willingness to accept model, like you can come to us and you can do business, but you can also leave. And if you're not finished interviewing, like interviewing some of the people that started the Data Liberation Front and seeing how that changed, because that seems close to your willingness to accept and how, you know, they expected it to be used, even if you know, I mean, it's corporate data. They're not just going to be like, hey, here's all our data about how it was used. But you can talk to the early contributors and designers. I think I would love to read that case study.
I would likewise be very interested. Maybe we can talk offline.
Elisa.
This is a question for Judith, but maybe it builds off of fast fashion. I was thinking about fashion trends and how there tends to be kind of shame that comes in if you're late adopting or continuing to wear things that are out of fashion. And I was curious if you feel like there's an opportunity for intervention there when it comes for false information in terms of how we make it unfashionable, or if that's even possible to do, or if there's stuff from the fashion literature in terms of how to.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in the fashion literature because no one else is looking at it quite through the lens of signaling. So, you know, and I think that notion of, and so there's basically two risks with fashion. So, you know, when I was talking earlier about signaling, understanding what the costs are. So the cost of being at the forefront of claiming this high status position is that's much riskier. And that's why it's the same adoption curve that innovations have, is that to be at the forefront requires a lot more skill than it does to be sort of at the tail end. So that's the risk of being the fashion victim. But at the sort of the tail end, it's less risky, but nobody's following you. So those people might be sending that stuff out, but they have many fewer followers. So in terms of, as a society, the problem with spreading the information is really the ones who are signaling influence more than following at the front, and they're the ones who have the value of it being disinformation. And I think for many people, I mean, part of the issue of things being a whole multiple series of hierarchies is that for many people who are at that very tail end, it's because either they don't care or they don't want to be at the front end of things. So,
Judith, you've talked about going low as a way of
counter signaling.
Yeah, I think it's related. Tell that.
I don't think it's related, but it's interesting. So I'll talk about it anyway. So it's a sort of other fashion related piece. So if you imagine a world, and I will remember the reference for this in a minute because this one is not my original to me, but where you have three layers. You could signal high, medium, and low. And so the people in the middle, some want to falsely signal that they're part of the high group. And then the ones who are low want to say that they're in the middle. And so part of it is you don't want to be copied by people who are deceptively claiming to be of your status. And so one strategy for high is to signal low because they can get away with that, but those in the middle can't. So one example of that is from like 10 years ago or 20 years ago at this point. We had like a lot of rappers were wearing, so they're wearing big, loose, baggy pants. And then you have a whole bunch of suburban boys who are like, I'm going to imitate them. They're really cool. And they start walking around in big, baggy pants. Fine. They were faking it. But then a lot of rappers started wearing Tommy Hilfiger, which is basically golf shirts and tennis clothes, with a little label on it, but it's basically golf clothing. But if you're a little middle-class white kid, you cannot wear that clothing and look cool because you're going to look like you're playing golf. So that was one of the ways that was essentially copying proof from doing that. And so there's a bunch of things you can look at here right now. Most of the examples I'm thinking of are clothing, but if my daughter, can wear 90s mom jeans, and she looks great. If I wear them, I look like a very out-of-style mother, So there's a whole set of things like that. We see certain phenomenon that fit in that pattern. It's just a way of sort of formalizing that behavior, or a model of that behavior.
And by the way, if I may ask, in what sense you dated the start of fashion to the 14th century? For the ancient Romans were super fashion conscious. Modern Romans too, but.
Right. So they were very, very conscious of how they dressed in terms of like what it said about their location in society. but the form of that dress didn't have this kind of change with no reason behind it. So it didn't change very frequently. When it did change, it was usually because there had been some change in society as a whole. And for reasons that I'm still trying to, I mean, I also have a history background, but for reasons I think that have to do with the opening of mercantile trade and the wealth of merchants in the 14th century, all of a sudden, if you look at history, people just don't like changing. And all of a sudden, the 14th century, people went from wearing basically the same clothing that their parents and grandparents have been wearing, these tunics and leggings. First, the leggings started changing color, then the tunics got really short. This is all of a sudden a decade. And then within less than a century, they were wearing those giant ruffs, and the ruffs grew and they shrank and they had levels. And there was this very fast change that started then and moved into other things. It was moving mainly through merchant classes in their competition with the nobility. So, and I think it's sort of it's often seen as this kind of weird side of, okay, here's modernity and all these other pre-industrializations, but part of the thesis I'm advancing is I think it has a somewhat more of a causative effect because of that importance of status now being related to having new and different things.
Fascinating. Thank you.
I have a question that sort of spans multiple speakers, from Judith to Aileen, and also drawing to the previous session as well. So hypothetical situation, and this is a personal question, not related to my work. A hypothetical situation. Should we imagine that in the future AI gets so good that bad actors from the previous session, underground market, somehow adopt it to use it to cause harm socially, quite widely? You can imagine the case where a fake call scam related to Biden in the primary a couple months ago. You can imagine where in other countries we have issue where companies would create fake news show using likeness of actual news readers to try to create semblance that their product is trustworthy. But this is being done by bad actors at a much rapid rate. Should we reach a future where that's the case? I can't imagine it being too far. And that the only defense, the only scalable defense, might be just straight up violating people's privacy and start collecting people's biometric match against these things to stop them at scale. But GDPR is standing there and says, nope, no private company can help any government do this. How do we react fast enough before society falls apart at the rate which things go?
You want to start? So GDPR, there are so many data protection specialists here that will probably help explain that national security and GDPR are kind of mutually exclusive issues. So I don't really see that ever happening, but I defer to all the other data fetish people in the room on that. So second point. Obviously, AI is already being used at scale in cybercrime. It hasn't been used as much actually in actual cyber attacks as much, except for whaling and writing much better phishing emails than anybody's ever seen before. But we talked about doppelganger and similar types of events for this info space, and that's definitely going to continue, but it's an arms race. But I think none of that arms race is ever going to be solved with the suggestion that I understood from you regarding GDPR standing in the way of collecting personal data that needed to be used to verify individual accounts. If your question is do we need to have true identity online to keep this happening? That's a different question, and I think that is a real threat for me personally, since I don't want that.
Let me clarify a little bit. I don't think true identity online will solve it, because the problem with the underlying problem with the hypothetical situation I just mentioned is the fact that bad actors don't have to respect GDPR, right? Bad actors can just start impersonating anyone without worrying about that. But the defender needs to care about it. And I agree that national security agencies don't have to worry about GDPR, but many of these solutions will require private sector to support it.
I tend to think this is a red herring. I don't buy this argument really from the ground up. Right, fake news and fake photographs has been around since photography. I remember photoshopping from the 80s. Stalin airbrushed people out of photos in the 50s. So this is not new. So I don't think AI fundamentally changes any dynamics here. But the problem with phishing is not the beginning of the funnel. I mean, we've had talks at this workshop about the reason phishing emails are so bad is because you want to exclude all but the most gullible as quickly as possible. You don't want AI to bring more people into your funnel. So I agree it's going to be an arms race. I don't see that change in degree, that change in kind that is going to make all of this different in this way. Also, don't see surveillance as the solution. I think it's very similar to the, China spying everybody so their AI is going to be better, which is another bullshit argument. So your turn.
Yeah. Well, I think when you say it's an arms race, the interesting answer is in what is the form that arms race takes. What are the things that come out of it? What are the new arms that we get? And so one of the issues, from the skilling work I do, is that one of the disturbing things we're seeing is that the demand for reliable information is actually pretty low. Like not in this room, but in the world at large. So I think one of the things you want to do to prevent scenario, like, I don't know if your specific scenario is the issue, but in general, is how do you raise the demand for reliable information? I think a lot of the answer there has to do with building up things like local news, where people actually pay a cost that they can perceive when they have believed the wrong thing. Some of the issues we're seeing is the decimation of local news, so that people are seeing mainly global news that has nothing to do with their everyday life. So the fact that it is treated much more as entertainment than as actionable information is a problem. And for those who, I think, the scenario you're talking about, the dangerous part is for people who actually do want to get good information, but they have become used to just kind of reading what's put in front of them online. It just shows up in their news feed and they don't really know what the sources are, and it makes them vulnerable to that. So I think I don't agree with Bruce. I do think we're going to be seeing a problematic flood of misinformation with AI. And the solution has to be to get people to be more aware of what the source of their information is, and to go back to relying on known sources a lot more, as opposed to just kind of random open pieces. So some of it, I think, is going to be along that line of having better use of things like, the New York Times or news, or it could be the things that we don't necessarily trust, but they trust, but a much greater emphasis on sources and less on the kind of open news we've become used to with Twitter, because I think people are going to have to pay, but they'll have to pay the cost of suffering their consequences before they will make that decision.
Just a two-finger on that, because I didn't think we were talking about misinfo and disinfo, but cybercrime. So my response to arms race was about cybersecurity issues, and just to explain what I mean by that. On the defense side, what you expect to see is increased anomaly detection at the edge. So basically that when somebody starts doing something on their device, which they don't normally do, you would get an alert. Basically saying, do you really want to send your money to Nigeria right now? You don't normally do that, right? So that's basically what was part of the arms race. Everything that occurs in the misinfo disinfo space is a bit larger, but I do agree with your one point about inattention. That was one of the articles put up there by a guy called Pennycook, a psychologist. His main point was that effectively it's a lack of discernation, a lack of taking time that is one of the main reasons people forward disinfo. But I don't think that the answers are that quickly circumscribed, but it's a good causality argument.
Just 2 points. So if you're interested in privacy versus security, existential threat porn, we have 9/11 and we have COVID, and at least in the legal community, there's ample things to read there, where I think we have grappled with these questions when they felt very immediate. And the only other thing I want to mention is putting in a plug for sort of proof of personhood protocols that are privacy preserving, and we have lots of those. So I think even if we go back to what some have called a red herring, there are fairly low tech ways to prove you're a human that are not even privacy invasive.
Recognize those boats.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 7 minutes. Let's see if we can take 3 final questions. Keep them short. It will be Tony, Lucy, and then Ben. Okay, Tom.
Sure. First, I wanted to give a quick thank you to Simson for the digital corpora site, which I've used in the past. I really appreciate you creating that as a service. And I have a question for Matt. I love that you're studying the history of security. And I think one of the challenges of studying this area is that it's so multidisciplinary, as evidenced by the people in this room. And so I'm wondering, how will you bring in these various disciplines together, and which ones will you prioritize?
Ooh.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great question. Well, yeah, I mean, so I'm trying to really focus on the evolution of the concept of vulnerability, right? So I think by tracking closely to that concept, hopefully I'll get some of the way to narrowing things to a manageable way. I mean, from what I can tell, that kind of language is initially used really in a kind of military adjacent community, and emerging from the U.S. context in the 1960s and 1970s, and then it starts to expand into being a term used for very particular discernible phenomenon. So how I'm imagining structuring the chapters is like having one chapter on the kind of military U.S. origins of that research, and then looking at it as it goes into like the more hacking community, and then having a more contemporary final couple of chapters that are looking at at a more global perspective. One of them looking at the vulnerabilities as it becomes commoditized, and zero-day markets and things like that. But then like a final chapter that's really looking at this expansiveness, and I think that's when I can think about all the interdisciplinary aspects of it, right? But this is a question I would love to have. Like, are there computer security or computer security adjacent discourses that were using the idea of vulnerability in a very discernible way, prior to the year 2000-ish? If there are, I would love to be told about them. I mean,
Cryptography is one.
Cryptography,
Sure.
For sure, absolutely, yeah. So that's a good one to think about. But yeah, I mean,
2000's late for a lot of us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Go back to the 60s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for which discipline?
All of us.
Computer science.
Computer security,
Yeah.
cryptography.
Right.
60s.
Simpson, when was your book?
Norbert Wiener's first thoughts were 1940 to 41. So.
Right. But I'm talking about like.
was 1986, wasn't
My first book's 93.
Right. No. Of course. But now I'm talking about like a very particular,
If you're talking about a remotely exploitable vulnerability, Morris Worm is probably
88.
big.
Right. But wait, but this is all
Okay.
stuff I'm taking into consideration. When you say interdisciplinary, what do you mean?
So, sorry, if I can interrupt, like if you talk about side channel vulnerabilities or man in the middle attacks, like you had in your graph, right? There was a beautiful like Van Eyck freaking thing at the back end, man in the middle attacks. That stuff has been literally as soon as technology has come out,
Right.
you have a vulnerability to discuss. Van Eyck freaking, I think it's been around since what, the 60s?
Yeah.
Right.
So man in the middle attack goes back to the Timmerman telegram and like before
Right.
the Second World War. So
But this, I don't understand. I
No,
mean,
that's
this is
technology.
what I'm talking about.
exactly. So there you go.
So when you say like interdisciplinary outside of the bounds of computer security, I mean, I guess I'm just curious what.
Well, I think computer security encompasses many disciplines. There's
Right.
not outside the bounds. It encompasses everything. So computer science, cryptography, law, psychology,
Economics.
Right. So I guess I'd be curious where to look to understand people talking about the idea of vulnerability in an economic psychology aspect that's directly related to computer security. I haven't seen a lot of that.
There
tell
were
me.
early discussions around security around every single time that computer systems were used socially, because once they hooked up a network, people started sending messages, and particularly when this was under ARPA, the military was very upset about this, and they had a lot of discussions about how insecure it was. And eventually Usenet came out of it to fight because the permitted discussion groups in ARPA were kept to be very, very limited, and Usenet was seen as this insecure open space.
Right.
So, I mean, but that was another issue around, like, is being social too vulnerable,
We should do this offline.
too many
Yeah.
vulnerabilities.
I think this will make
So
a
dinner
wonderful,
tonight.
wonderful
Plans.
cocktail conversation. Lucy, Ben, Jane, I apologize. We just ran out of time. I'm so sorry. We will be able to ask
But,
questions
I have a
over
chapter.
cocktails.
I have a
I would
chapter
like
on that
to
if you
thank the
wanna-
panel and thank you. It